So firstly, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. I think we've had quite a big response to this webinar, so hopefully the system will sort of manage it. We're due to run for about an hour and a half. Hopefully we'll sort of be able to stick to time. We have had quite a few questions sort of submitted beforehand, and we'll go through those at the end and share them amongst the sort of presenters. Obviously, we've got two presentations this afternoon from ICE and from Oritain. I'll just introduce the speakers in a few moments. Firstly, though, I'll say we will ensure that we can send around some information afterwards, and particularly if we don't get through all of the Q&As, we'll try and answer the ones that we don't get to today and sort of send them around afterwards. There will be a YouTube video put up in due course once we've sort of managed the sort of the editing. For those people on the call that are BCA members, obviously for this particular topic of deforestation, we've got a section on the website, so you're able to also to go to that afterwards and see various of the Q&As that have been produced either by us or by the EU. So without further ado, let's get into the presentations. Second on the list, we have the presentation from ICE, and on the call today, we've got Toby Brandon, Clive de Ruig and Gary Hooper from ICE and from ICE Benchmark Administration. So we'll be hearing from them shortly about the tool that they've been putting together, and some of you may already have seen elements of that and heard some bits and pieces before. So hopefully we'll cover all of that today. But first, we're going to have a presentation from Freddie Duffield of Oritain. I think it's fair to say Oritain have been in the sort of the environment of identification of origin and confirmation of origin for a little while, so certainly predating the deforestation, and a slightly different approach, I guess, in terms of the sort of science and technology behind it. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that first. So I think without further ado, oh, sorry, one other thing I will say, we've got some questions that have come in beforehand. If you want to put additional questions in while you hear the presentations, please use the Q&A rather than the chat box that you should have at the top of your screen. And we'll come back to those afterwards. So Freddie, can I now hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Paul, good afternoon, and good afternoon, everyone. I know it's a hot and busy day, so hopefully the technology will stay with us, and hopefully you should now be just seeing the presentation popping up on your screen. My thanks also to Thomas for supporting on some of the tech pieces for this. So as Paul very kindly introduced at Oritain, my name is Freddie, and I'm going to just be walking through just a few points here today, but really want to also get into your questions, which I hear from the team at BCA we're going to have lots of, and I'm sure there'll be some popping into the chat as we go. So really just a big thank you before we go any further from us at Oritain to the BCA for inviting us to this. So as Paul very kindly said, yes, we have been in the world of coffee for some time. Actually, our business has very much been on physical traceability. So rather than looking at paper trails, rather than looking at blockchain, rather than looking at some of the more traditional traceability methods, which absolutely have their place, Oritain has approached it from a slightly different perspective. Since 2008, where we've always been is about testing the physical product. So rather than having to go to your suppliers and your producers and your smallholders, we're able to work directly on the product itself, and that's particularly pertinent for something like coffee. Many of you might have actually come across some of our work in other commodities, particularly in the likes of cotton, where we work extensively with global companies as well as the US government. The way that we've always been trying to do is to make sure that we root our work into two elements: data-driven insights and science. And the science has always been really the sort of the pinnacle of Oritain. At our two founders, Helen Darling and Dr. Professor Russell Frew. If for any of you in the sort of chemistry space, he is actually the leading world in isotopic chemistry and isotopic analysis. And I'll come on to what that means in a little while, but he's been advising the UN for some years now. So we really do stand behind the science. And I think, as I put there on my second point, it meets something called the Eudr criteria, which for non-lawyers in the room means that it is actually capable of being used as forensic science in the court of law. So there's something that you would likely see in cutting-edge forensic laboratories in the Home Office or the FBI in the United States, for example. This is exactly the same type of technology. And we've worked with clients for many years, since 2008, and we have clients in about 25 countries now and 25 separate commodities. So just a little bit on the science, just before we dive in. Obviously, like coffee and many other raw earth commodities, each one has a unique chemical fingerprint, very much similar to a fingerprint, which is why we have a little fingerprint on our logo. It's different and it's traceable by things like the climate it's grown in, the soil, the fertilizer, the rain, and the topography of the land. And all of that can be mapped. And we've mapped 95% of the world's cotton, and we're well over 80% in the world's coffee. So really making fantastic progress at being able to map extensive databases of where coffee comes from right across the world, which particularly for the topic we're discussing here today with the BCA is a really important fundamental point. Each one has unique different elements and chemical isotopes. So it's very, very simple to be able to see it together. But also the forensic science is incredibly complicated. And many of you, if you've been in the science space before, will know that commercializing forensic science is extremely difficult, but at Oritain, we've been able to do it. So I wanted to pull up this one just as a little sort of visual representation of what we mean. So here on the right-hand side of the graph, you'll see from 4 samples. We've got Brazil, Honduras, Indonesia, and Rwanda. These are just examples. We obviously work in many other countries as well, but it's just an example to really bring it to life from a visual representation. What we've seen here is the unique chemical elements and isotopes from those different countries. You can clearly see they're very, very different, not just in the color, but in the scales on the top, right, left, and center, which shows for a very clear picture where we can tell you that if your claimed origin, for example, we're working with Nescafé in Brazil at the moment. So what we can tell them is that their Brazilian coffee is absolutely from Brazil, or if they have a supply chain problem, it's not from Brazil. And that's one of the great joys we've been able to do. So it works right across the world, and it works from small holdings, large multinationals, and also the traders in between. So a really powerful piece of technology. And I always quite like this one as a nice visual representation. Just a little bit on the sort of how the science works going through. So as I said, because we use forensic science, we always try and maintain chain of custody. So we're able to collect those samples directly. They're analyzed in our labs. We have them in Northern and Southern Hemisphere because our clients are truly global. And obviously Oritain is a global business, so we are able to do that. The fingerprints then are allowed us to work with our clients to be able to understand any problems. And I think that's one of the big watchwords I would say today, ladies and gentlemen, is it's not just a moment in time. It's ongoing strategic counsel. And as I'm sure the other speakers will be articulating today, and I'll underscore, we all know that the legislation came in very recently, and there is a short 24-month window for companies to really sort of get their arms around it. And it's a very complex piece of legislation. So the message I would give at this point, ladies and gentlemen, is start now. Don't wait. Don't sort of think that it'll all be fine, or that think that member states won't engage with it. It'll be okay. What we found at Oritain when we did for cotton, which had a very similar political element to it in terms of risk regions and forced labor, is that companies that proactively got ahead of the problem had a reputational advantage and a minimizing of risk. So I think that's a really, really strong message. Some of the proven methodologies we've seen there, so you avoid things like additives, sprays, and we actually test the product, which, as I said, is again really helpful for small people who work with small holdings. So it's really, really strong technology. Just a couple of other ones. I think, Paul, we're probably going to get into, what the legislation is. So I think we probably can skip over that one. But happy to answer any technical questions, but really want to make sure that I don't monopolize the discussion, because I'm sure there's going to be a really interesting presentation from ICE coming immediately after this. There's just a couple of points to really round off, as I said, ladies and gentlemen, is cutting edge forensic science isn't science fiction. It is existence now. It's commercially viable. And it's something that we've been able to really fine tune as a world leader in the space for the last few years. And I've just put a couple of coffee clients there that we work with. Some of the others are confidential, but just a couple, obviously, from Hawaii through to Brazil, Nescafé, and then, of course, Cerrado. So a really good mix of geographies and sizes. In terms of, just to reiterate again, we can demystify that supply chain for you. We work with you, so you don't have that ghastly moment of thinking that it's all too much and it's all too complicated. It can be done, and it can be done really, really well at a cost-effective point. So I'm going to wrap it up there and hand back to Paul, but just to sort of close to say, the truth does lie within it, and I really would like to welcome Paul from the next speaker, but just to say thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Paul.
Let's move on now, and thank you, and look at the next presentation, which, as Freddie just mentioned, is from ICE. As I mentioned, we have the 3 presenters on. I think, Toby, you're perhaps going to lead off. Just before Toby starts, one more quick mention. The Q&A is the place to drop your questions. As I say, we've got a number that we've had in already prior to the event, and we'll cover those at the end. But any more that come up through the presentation, please drop in. If you want to target them to a particular speaker, please drop that in as well. Otherwise, we'll pick them up and share them around. So with that, over to you, Toby.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks again to the BCA for this this chance to talk to you all. So I work for ICE Futures Europe, where I'm responsible for soft commodities. That means for coffee that I'm responsible for the smooth running of the Robusta coffee futures contract. And I work closely with my colleagues at ICE Futures US who look after the coffee C contract. So we'd be very happy to take more extensive questions about those contracts and the EUDR impact after this call. And today I'm here with two colleagues from another business within the ICE group, which is IBA. So today we'll give a short summary of what the EUDR entails, and we'll explain the timing and requirements of the EUDR and how it affects parties in the supply chain and how it represents real challenges for the coffee trade and industry. Then I'll hand over to my colleagues and they'll present to you the ICoT service. We hope this will be a tool that the whole trade and industry can use to ease trade under these new regulations. And then finally, as part of that, we'll explain a bit more about IBA, which is the business within ICE building ICoT. But please remember, these regulations were designed by the European Commission. It's a European Parliament law. They're not ICE laws or regulations. We do have to adapt our futures contracts to take them into account. But please, although we're giving you the background, don't shoot the messenger here. And I'd also like to make a quick disclaimer. This presentation is for your information only. It does not constitute legal advice or professional advice on the interpretation of the regulations, advice on trading or market prices or direction, etc., etc. And if you need further information on that disclaimer, there's a slide at the back. So we will try and give you a summary, but we're not giving you advice. So the EU Deforestation Regulation covers 7 commodities, including coffee. The regulation was passed by the European Parliament to ensure that the consumption of certain products in the EU does not further contribute to global deforestation. And here you can see a direct copy and paste from the legislation. In simple terms, it effectively says that all coffee imported into and exported from the EU must be deforestation free. So it does actually include trade within the EU, and it's not just about imports, it's also about exports. A key part of the application of the regulation is the due diligence statement. And this is essentially a statement when the coffee enters Europe and when it exits Europe that it meets the regulation. So what is the EUDR? Well, firstly, you need to be aware of the key dates. The cutoff date for deforestation is 31st of December 2020. And the regulation became law in Europe when it entered into force on the 29th of June 2023. But the application date of the regulation, so the date when national authorities begin to make checks, is the 30th of December 2024. So in principle, there is an 18-month transition period for everyone to prepare for the regulation. Now, a key part of the key principle of the regulation is the reversal of the burden of proof. So this is a real challenge because of this principle. Traders and operators are liable and must be able to prove that all the coffee they bring into Europe and trading in Europe meets the regulation. So it's not like a food safety regulation where authorities have to test materials and find a banned substance in order for there to be a breach. With this deforestation regulation, the burden is on the company to prove that it's bought or sold coffee from a compliant supply chain. And the key element is the due diligence statement, or the DDS. So companies, traders and operators in Europe have to lodge a DDS, due diligence statement, when they place or make available coffee on the European market. This essentially means when they sell coffee within the EU. And that DDS must include a list of farm locations from where the material has been sourced, which could be the geolocation points, or if the farm's over 4 hectares, it needs to be a polygon map. So in addition to that basic farm information, the DDS is a declaration that the company has met the full due diligence requirements of the regulations. And those requirements are laid out in Articles 9, 10 and 11, which I have some quotes from on the screen. So it includes much more information gathering than there's actually reported on the DDS itself, which is essentially just a list of farms. It also includes risk assessment and risk mitigation measures. So that information will need to include the quantity, the time of production, the country, the geolocation, and the name and address of suppliers. And all of that must constitute adequately conclusive and verifiable information that the relevant products are deforestation free. Companies must have carried out a risk assessment to verify and analyse the information collected and the risk of non-compliance in the supply chain. Where risk assessments identify less than negligible risk of non-compliance, then operators will need to take further measures, which is where risk mitigation comes in. And that means collecting additional data, carrying out audits, and having adequate controls and measures and systems in place. So all of this information and all of these processes can be checked and audited by the authorities for up to 5 years. So all of the data has to be stored for up to 5 years. So the regulation uses these terms frequently throughout its pages, the terms trader and operator. And the regulation states that traders and operators will be liable and must be able to rely on data provided by the supply chain from which they source the products. So they're liable for the compliance of what they're trading. But be aware that the term trader is not really how the coffee industry would traditionally view a trader. So the actual definition is as here, any person in the supply chain other than the operator being the importer who makes relevant products available on the market. So the obligations of that trader is that they need to file a due diligence statement and they need to check the due diligence previously carried out in supply chain. And they're also liable in case of a breach of the regulation. So then we've had from the EU, from the European Commission already, a set of FAQs which were helpful. And we heard recently that those FAQs will be updated, I think they said regularly. So expect some updates soon, some additional answers. And the ones issued back in June answered a few questions. And it made it clear that everyone in the supply chain is liable for breaching the regulation. So anyone selling into Europe will need to be compliant, otherwise they won't find a European buyer. The regulation stipulates that authorities must check up to 9% of traders and operators, and the penalties can be large. They can be up to 4% of a company's turnover within the EU. So these are serious penalties. So what did we do at the exchange? Well, back in February, when the regulations were being finalised, we issued a public notice to put the market on alert. We said that the regulation was coming, but not yet finalised. We noted that contracts affected by the regulation were about to be listed in the case of Robusta coffee, and some were already listed in the case of Coffee C. And we noted that the exchange reserves the right to change the terms of those contracts in order to adjust to the regulations. We invited market participants to give us their views and feedback, and the initial feedback, well, actually continuous feedback since then, has been that since the delivery points of the futures contract are almost all in Europe, the terms of the contract should be aligned with the regulation standards. I wouldn't say that's everyone's view, but that's the consensus view. So we continue to source that feedback, and please get in touch if you've got views or questions, and stay tuned for further exchange notices about the futures contract and how it will have to adapt. So looking at the timing, one of the challenges for us, as I said, is that we were about to list Robusta contracts as the legislation was being finalised, and some Coffee C contracts were already listed. So we already have open interest in 2025 for some of the futures contracts, small in Robusta, large in Arabica. And they're already certified stocks in Europe at that point in time, and certified stocks could continue to build between the entry into force date, which was June, through to January 2025, which is the entry into application. So this is a real challenge for us at the exchange, considering that the regulations only finally became law 6 weeks ago. We have to deal with this in an orderly fashion. And we're still getting FAQs from the European Commission. We're still getting interpretations and clarifications of how the regulations will actually work. So we wrote and issued a white paper a few months ago asking questions that we'd like the European Commission to clarify. We've not actually had official written answers to those questions, but some of it's in the FAQ, and we've heard some of the answers verbally from the European Commission. They've been quite clear about case one. So stocks already in Europe before 29th of June 2023 will not have the regulation applied, and so therefore you could consider them compliant from that perspective. But stocks arriving after June 2023 and clearing customs before 2024, which is case 2A in this diagram, they will be compliant from the perspective that they also won't have the regulation applied, because the regulation is applied at the point of customs clearance from January 2025 onwards. So the problem we have is stocks arriving in Europe after June 2023, remaining in a bonded status, but not clearing customs until after 30th of December 2024. So it looks like they won't be considered compliant, and we have to figure out how to handle those. So we understand as well that there are several similar related points to case 2B with coffee already in Europe waiting to be processed, that the rest of the coffee industry is raised, and they're waiting for clarification from the European Commission on that, and that could have a big impact on the market. So once we get those outstanding interpretations clarified, then we can finalise drafting of the changes to the exchange contract terms. So what does this mean in practice? So we've already talked about the basic data that's required from a farm perspective. If you put that into perspective, a 20-foot container should have 320 bags in it, so that it should be 320 plus farms. So you need farm locations of 320 farms and traceability data showing that the coffee came from those farms. If you had a 100-ton bill of lading, then that would be 3,000 farms. But that's assuming that the coffee is segregated and not mixed. If you add in the milling process, where beans are mixed and sorted for quality and screen size, then those numbers are multiplied. So that could be multiplied by 3 times. So your 300 farms for a 20-foot container could become 1,000. Your 100-ton bill of lading could become 10,000 farmers. So it's a huge amount of data to source, to check, and then to store that data and to pass on through the supply chain from seller to buyer. So yeah, this is a visualization of the supply chain, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. That data has to come from the first collection point all the way through the supply chain. And one reaction to that could be to reduce links in the supply chain. So as a buyer, I could reduce the number of sellers I buy from and only buy through a direct supply chain. So that could lead to supply chains becoming siloed. And by direct sourcing and by direct supply chains, we mean where the supply chain is under the control of one company from the point of purchase through to roasting or manufacturing. So that means if that was to happen, the focus of physical trading could move from multiple sellers offering FOB sales, which is currently the case. So lots of trading takes place at the FOB stage at the point of export. You could change to lots of trading taking place, most sales terms becoming in Europe and delivered factory. So if that happens, physical trading within the supply chain could become much less liquid. But it's not clear that would solve the problem. It would make it easier for information to flow just through one direct closed supply chain. But buyers of coffee in Europe would still be responsible that they've checked the due diligence that's been applied to that supply chain and to that data. So it wouldn't necessarily solve the problem from that perspective. And it could reduce liquidity in trading. So just to summarize then the challenges for the coffee industry, we didn't actually talk about the first challenge, which is the first question is, will there be enough compliant coffee available in 2025 and beyond? So there may well be enough coffee, as in not from deforested sources, but that coffee needs to be traceable. And there need to be systems in place to have the geolocation recorded, and traceability systems to record that from the point of purchase, to show it comes from the farmer, all the way through the supply chain to Europe. And so every transaction in Europe or bound for Europe needs to have that compliance data, and that then pushes the requirement really back to origin. And everyone selling from origin, if they want to sell into Europe, is going to need to be able to provide that data. So the key to finding enough coffee will be to incorporate coffee supply chains outside of those already existing direct supply chains. So third-party suppliers and indirect supply chains will need to be incorporated somehow. So by indirect, I mean when there's more than one party in the supply chain. So currently, if I'm buying FOB, I might have a choice of, I don't know, 10 or so exporters that I can buy from. If those that would be an indirect supply chain. So I would need that indirect supply chain to be able to offer me the compliance data. If that isn't available, then I won't be able to take it into Europe, so I wouldn't be able to meet the due diligence requirements. So we're suggesting that there needs to be a readily available system to incorporate and validate farm and traceability data from these independents and from this indirect supply chain. So the concern is that without that, an over-reliance on the direct supply chain would mean that there's not enough compliant coffee, and also that there'd be less liquid trading, and there'd be decommoditization of the trading within coffee because of these huge amounts of data that need to be handed across from seller to buyer. So what we're suggesting is that compliance data that's required, that has to go all the way through the chain, needs to become standardized so that it can be exchanged alongside the standard package of documentation that's involved in the coffee trade. So when you receive your bill of lading, your origin certificate, your phyto certificate, you would also receive your compliance data package that's been validated so that you can meet the EUDR compliance terms. So just to finish, for the futures exchange delivery terms, we look forward to hearing views on that. The delivery points in Europe for the Robusta contract mean that we need to align the standards with the regulation. We'll be taking views on how to do that, and we're open for views now, and we'll be taking views over the next month or so, and so look out for notifications from the exchange on that. So our initial assessment is that we need to align certified stock with the European deforestation regulation standards. If we don't do that, that coffee won't be usable in Europe, which would mean that there would be a divergence between the futures contract standards and value and the actual physical market requirements, standards and value in Europe. So similar to grading coffee for quality, which we already do before we allow it to be delivered to the exchange, we intend to, or we're looking at introducing compliance data checks on the EUDR and compliance information. And for that, we've been looking to build a platform so that we can do those validation checks with confidence. So at that point, I'll hand over to my colleagues who will explain to you more about that platform. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you for that, Toby. So hello, everyone. My name is Gary Hooper. I'm part of the team here at ICE Benchmark Administration. We're a subset of ICE, and I'm one of the people working on the design of what we've called the ICoT system, Commodity Traceability System, that we will be going through today. In this part of the presentation, my aim is to give you an overview of the services that the ICoT system will provide to support the operators in meeting their requirements under this new EUDR regulation, and ensuring, and this is the key focus, ensuring that coffee can continue to be traded freely throughout the supply chain. So this slide highlights what we're what we believe to be the key focus of the ICoT platform. So it illustrates how ICE really is focused on supporting trade between buyers and sellers along the supply chain. So firstly, we have coverage. So the first point to note is that this system is available for use across the whole coffee industry. Although we are an exchange that, although ICE is an exchange that trades coffee and cocoa futures, this platform isn't limited to only being used for beans that are being delivered for the futures contracts. It's going to be open to all physical trade. Second point is on standardization. So one of the key requirements of the regulation is to be able to pass traceability data along the supply chain. To do that, there has to be a common standard defined, and that common standard has to be in use across the whole supply chain. With this platform, we're aiming to establish such common standard and to provide details of both the format and the content of the traceability data that the system will require and hold for each parcel. Through the ICE working group that we're intending to set up for this, IBO will ensure that we agree a standard that's backed by key stakeholders across the whole coffee industry. There'll be more on what we mean by traceability data on the next slide. Another key point is confidentiality. So agreeing a standard is an important step for creating a mechanism for sharing traceability data, but not everyone along the supply chain would be happy to share their whole supply chain information with all potential buyers along that complete supply chain. So ICoT addresses this issue by ensuring that this sensitive data can move from buyer to seller without the full details of that data being disclosed to each seller. That information will always be available to the EU national competent authorities if they need it, though, if they're carrying out an audit under the regulation. Another issue that we've considered is validation. Even if someone was to give you full details of the, as Toby was explaining, 3,000 plots that the parcel you've just bought to come from, what would you actually do with that information to ensure it was compliant? And essentially that means that under the regulation, just passing the traceability data from buyer to seller isn't sufficient for the buyer to demonstrate they've carried out their due diligence. They would also have to actually do something with that data. So our system can facilitate this task by carrying out independent validation to ensure that the traceability data demonstrates that the parcel is compliant with the regulation, as well as carrying out other checks to ensure that the data is complete and is reasonable. So the last point on this slide was trust. A seller of a product can use ICoT to demonstrate to a potential buyer that the traceability data for their parcel meets the required standards and is sufficient to demonstrate compliance with the regulation. The aim here is to increase trust and reduce friction between buyers and sellers within the supply chain. So the next few slides are to illustrate how ICoT delivers these features to operators. So what we're aiming to do is to track parcels through the coffee supply chain. Essentially, ICoT is a system that tracks every parcel of coffee as it moves along the supply chain from initially the farms through to being imported into Europe and final products being produced. Each parcel that ICoT tracks is associated with a complete set of traceability data for that parcel. And for our terms, for ICoT, the traceability data includes 3 different sets of data. Firstly, you have the farm plots from which product was sourced. So this is the key information that's required in the due diligence statement, where you have to actually list all the plots that the product came from. Secondly, you have the physical flows, so showing how the product that's currently in the parcel moved from the farm plots to wherever it is now. So this would cover product movements from farms, potentially to co-ops or local buying centres, from those aggregators to regional warehouses, from export port to import ports, things are shipped and so on. And this is a sort of information that's going to be sourced from purchase records, waybills, bills of lading, etc. And finally, you have the last set of data within the kind of traceability information. It's to do with processing. So this details of any processing or transformations that the products have gone through as they move through the supply chain. Now, it's important to note that the point in the supply chain in which an operator first chooses to add a parcel to ICoT can be chosen by the operator. Essentially, it can be any point before the operator wishes to make that parcel available to a potential buyer on ICoT, or to use ICoT to facilitate the submission of a due diligence statement. So we're not mandating that someone has to, as soon as you've got something at a regional warehouse, it needs to be put onto ICoT, or as soon as it starts to be shipped to Europe. It can be any point in the supply chain where the operator needs it to be on ICoT because they want to use ICoT to facilitate the trade of that product, or to be able to use ICoT for the submission of the due diligence statement. So I mentioned trade there, but trading is supported by allowing the current owner of a parcel to transfer that parcel to another user within the system. So just to be clear, ICoT isn't a trading platform. We don't offer any matching of buyers or sellers and publishing of prices. Instead, trading will occur outside of the system using whatever mechanisms operators currently use. It could be simple bilateral trading over the phone or any other trading system. But once a trade has occurred, if a parcel is currently within ICoT, then the seller of that parcel will be responsible for transferring the ownership or handing over that parcel to the buyer. Our system won't require any details of the trade price or the terms of trade, just that we need to know who the buyer of that new parcel is and the date of transfer. And the key point is, when a parcel moves from buyer to seller, the associated traceability data that was held for that parcel within the system moves along with that parcel and is now under the control of the new owner, who can then build upon that traceability data as that product continues to move through their own supply chain. And ICoT will support a parcel once you received it. You could submit details of that parcel being moved to another location. It could be merged with other parcels as things are aggregated. It could be split, if you're splitting a large parcel into lots of subsets, or the parcel could be undergoing processing. And that can happen to a parcel as many times as is necessary to support whatever each operator is doing within their supply chain. Another point that's significant is around our support for due diligence statements. So we're aiming to support the facilitation and creation and the submission of the due diligence statements to the EU information system. The EU are intending to set up an electronic system for these due diligence statements to be submitted to, and some of you may have seen the demonstration that was done on that a few months ago. Hopefully that system will be in place before the well, it's intended to be in place sometime before the regulation enters into application at the end of next year. Essentially, all of the data required within the due diligence system, crucially including the plots from which product was sourced, will be available within the ICoT system, so we're able to generate the required due diligence statement for an operator. Now, we're also looking at supporting the national competent authority checks. The key reason that we're aiming to collect traceability data that goes beyond simply saying, for this parcel, here's a list of 1,000 or 3,000 plots, is that this additional traceability information is expected to be required when a national competent authority carries out a check on an operator or on one or more of their parcels. As Toby mentioned earlier, that the regulation actually requires up to 9% of operators and parcels to be checked by the national competent authorities each year. The actual volume checked is dependent on the risk that's identified for each origin country. The default is standard risk, and that's then 3%. Country is identified as low risk, then it's 1%. But if it's identified as high risk, then it's 9%. So it's a fairly significant proportion of products coming into the EU that are expected to be checked. And when those checks carried out, we expect the EU will require information showing the full movement of products from the origin farm. So if you said it came from these 3,000 farms, you would need to demonstrate the route those products took actually from all those 3,000 farms. And our system can make available this full set of traceability data to an NTA when an operator is subject to such check. On to the next slide, please, Toby. So this slide provides a high-level overview of how we intend the system to operate. Broadly, the process moving from the left to the right. On the left-hand side, we have some of the key sources of the traceability information that an operator could use in supplying their data to ICoT. So these could be in-house systems, third-party traceability systems, or other data providers. Some origin countries, there may be national traceability systems that are either going to be in place by the time regulation comes into application or potentially after that. So operators will take this data from various sources and submit it to our platform. And we break down this submission into two separate steps. The first step is a submission of the farm plot data. So if you were to say get details from co-op or aggregators of all the farms for that aggregator, you could submit that data before you actually have any parcels associated with products from that operator. The aim there is to allow operators to have their farm data validated by the system and to have time to resolve any issues with that data before those farms are associated with any actual coffee parcels. So our system will validate this data and inform the operator of the status of every farm that they've submitted. So each farm will either be essentially compliant because it's passed all the checks. It could be invalid if it's failed some checks, but they could just be sensibility checks, such as the plot shape is unreasonable, or it's non-compliant. That's the most important check. That's where it overlaps with areas of deforestation. Once farm plot data is in place and it's been validated, operators can then submit data for their parcels as those parcels move along the supply chain. So this includes all the traceability data that I mentioned earlier, showing how the products move from the farms. And again, this data will be validated by ICoT. Once a parcel is within the system, the operator can carry out one of three key tasks, or there's three key services that ICoT provides. Firstly, demonstrating compliance of the parcel to another ICoT user. So by having this, a parcel on ICoT and showing that that parcel's been identified as valid and compliant, a buyer can use this to enhance trust with their seller. So this is something that can be done pre-trade. Secondly, an operator can hand over ownership of their parcel to a buyer. So this is to reflect their trading activities. So that's a post-trade activity. Thirdly, as mentioned before, we'll support the creation and submissions of due diligence statements. And as I said before, we're also aiming at providing the information to the EU competent authorities, shown in the bottom right, if they wish to use our system to look for more information about a parcel. So on to the next slide, please. Thanks, Toby. So the process starts, here we're just dealing with a very simple example of a supply chain and how that would be reflected within our system. So the process will start with the first party who is entering data for a parcel, submitting, having collected the supply chain data for that parcel and submitting the relevant traceability data to ICoT. So those are the first two steps here. Essentially, this is a product that's ready to be shipped or is being shipped to the EU. It could be a 100-ton parcel of actual coffee beans, and it has the traceability data showing the farms from which that 100 tons of product came from. So on to the next slide, please. Thanks. So here's a simple example of how we're supporting trade. So in this case, Party A is shipping the product to the EU to a bonded warehouse, i.e. it's going to be held pre-customs within the EU. So it hasn't crossed the customs border yet. So while the product is in this bonded warehouse, Party A sells the parcel to another party, so Party B. So within ICoT, this would be step 3. So that's actually handing over, transferring the parcel and all of its associated traceability data from Party A to Party B. Now, Party B has bought this product and presumably they want to actually use it within the EU. So at some point, they're going to have to actually move that product through customs and place it on the EU market. At that point, Party B is required to submit a due diligence statement. So they can use our platform to facilitate the submission of that due diligence statement. And we'll be tracking the response, the due diligence statement submission number that received back from the EU information system. And you need that because further downstream, you should be referring back to that due diligence statement. And on to the next slide, please, Toby. So again, Party B wish to sell this product. They could be selling it on to a final, a producer of a final product, such as an EU brand. And again, this would be another case of ICoT facilitating the transfer of the ownership of that parcel from one party to another. So again, it would be Party B in this case, transferring the product to Party C, who, when they produce their final product, they'll have all the traceability data demonstrating compliance with the regulation as required if they're audited by the one of the NCAs. Now, obviously, this is a really simple, trivial example of how products have moved through the supply chain, but generally illustrates the basic points that of products being handed over and the flow of the data along with that product as moves along the supply chain. Obviously, in practice, there'll be many steps of mixing, merging, and processing that the platform would also support. But the overall principle remains the same as in this very simple example. So on to what we'll do in terms of validating this data. So next slide, please, Toby. Thanks. So another key point of the service that we'll be providing is providing independent validation for both the farm data and the traceability data associated with particular parcels, which is aimed at both supporting buyers having confidence in what they're buying, but also ensuring that buyers meet their obligations of fulfilling their due diligence requirements of carrying out checks on the data they're provided. So our system will be designed to carry out automated checks on all farm and traceability data to essentially ensure both compliance and that the data is reasonable and plausible. So firstly, there's the key validation of ensuring that each plot is not on an area of deforestation, according to the reference map. Now, as we understand it, there should be a reference map of deforestation produced by the EU Observatory. They're aiming to produce their first maps by the end of this year. So that's what we're initially expecting to be using as a definition of deforestation to ensure compliance with the regulation. There may be more details on that coming up. Secondly, there's validating that each plot is not within a protected forest, so another essential compliance check, because according to the regulation, your parcels must not only be deforestation free, but as Toby mentioned earlier, they've got to be in compliance with local laws. So one simple check for that is to ensure the plots themselves are not in protected forests. As well as that, there's a large number of checks that we'll be carrying out. There's a few dozen in terms of additional what you call sense and reasonability checks. So anyone familiar with this area, and they'll understand that in some cases there can be issues with the quality of the data in terms of if you get plots, they may not be reasonable shapes, or you can see extremely large plots, extremely small plots that are smaller than a desk, plots that are actually on bodies of water. So there's a lot of checks you can carry out on the farm data with those kind of issues, and again on the physical flows, so you can check that products moving from a farm to an aggregator, what is the distance of that movement? Are all the volumes throughout the supply chain consistent? If you're showing 100 tons moving from a warehouse, do you have a history of data showing 100 tons of product moving to that warehouse, and so on? So that's it for this part of the presentation. Hopefully this has given you a reasonable basic understanding of what we're planning to deliver with this service. I'm now going to hand over to Clive. He's going to explain more about who we are at IBA and why we feel we are uniquely placed to help provide this solution to the industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all for you all to joining as well. We greatly appreciate the time that you're giving us. I wanted to explain a little bit about ICE benchmark administration. ICE, as you know, is a large company with a number of different exchanges and clearing houses and other services within the group. And I just want to explain why IBA has been chosen to be the business that delivers this solution. So I'd like to do that and talk about some of the features and benefits as well. So IBA's core mission is to provide robust and reliable services that facilitate the smooth functioning of commodity and financial markets globally. So we were born out of the desire to have an administrator that could take on in 2013, could take on the administration of the Libor benchmark that, as many of you will know, was a deeply troubled benchmark back in 2013, and we did a great job, I think, of rehabilitating that rate prior to its cessation. We're good at three things at IBA: governance, technology, and data management. And we deploy our domain expertise across those three fields to solve problems that affect markets, and particularly commodity and financial markets. The administrative services that we provide today are listed on the right-hand side here, with the administrator for the London Bullion Market Association gold and silver auctions. As I said, we used to provide panel bank Libor. We continue to provide a suite of interest rate products, and we provide a reference database for carbon projects as well. So that's the focus of IBA. What can we do to provide more certainty and more predictability to markets? And obviously this new EUDR regulation coming into effect at the end of next year, it is an area where markets that ICE is deeply involved in, but also sees a significant issue potentially for our customers and our markets on the horizon in terms of how do we comply with EUDR and how do we do that in a way that allows us to maintain our existing business models. So if we go to the next slide, please, Toby. I just want to talk a little bit about governance, because governance is a really important part of what we provide, and governance builds trust around the services that IBA provides. Trust from the participants in those particular markets, trust from the official sector, national competent authorities. So IBA is different in many ways from other firms at ICE in that we have an independent board of directors. There are 7 directors that are non-executive, and there are only 2 directors that are ICE employees, including me. So we're independent. We provide a huge amount of transparency over the services that we provide, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in the next slide in terms of our oversight committees. But we realise that to build trust, things have to be very transparent. And if ICoT is to work as a service, everyone needs to know exactly what ICoT is doing. Documentation needs to be publicly available. When we make changes, we need to consult broadly. All of these things are really important in building trust and will be very important to the boards of the companies that you represent and your risk committees as well, given the scale of fines that are in the legislation. I think 4% of EU revenue. Again, we'll come to oversight and our oversight committees in the next slide. But a really important point is that IBA has really significant experience of solving difficult problems, not least when we took over the administration of libel. So we have experience and proven delivery. The benefits of all of this is that it generates really broad stakeholder engagement. We ensure that the solutions that we provide have strong industry support. And we're also able, and this is particularly important when industries and companies are getting together that are naturally competitors, that are getting together to solve a problem, we're very good and have a great deal of knowledge at understanding how we can manage either perceived or actual conflicts of interest. So those features and all the benefits that they provide basically all add up to building a high trust environment that we feel will be really important in ensuring that the coffee remains a tradable commodity post the end of next year. So if we can go to the next slide, Toby. I just wanted to set out here in diagrammatic form how our oversight and advisory committees work. So you can see the board of directors right in the center there. That is the independent board that I spoke about. In traditional style, that has an audit and risk committee that overviews certain aspects of the board's work and advise the board. And we also have a nomination and corporate governance committee. And that's a particularly important committee when it comes to the oversight committees, which are here on the right-hand side of the diagram. So we already have 5 benchmark oversight committees today for ICE swap rate. We have a precious metal oversight committee for our gold and silver. So every service that we provide has an oversight committee, and ICoT will be no different. So we will be setting up an ICoT advisory and oversight committee. We are more than likely talking, I don't know who's on this call, but it's a number of the firms on this call to staff this committee. When you propose a name, when a firm says that they want to take part in the oversight committee and they propose a name of an attendee, that will then have to go through our nomination and corporate governance process to make sure that person is suitable to be on the committee, and then the committee will start its work. But the huge advantage of these oversight committees is that they provide an independent governance and oversight over the direction of the service that we're providing over ICoT. They can provide really important input in respect of how ICoT is developed and make sure that it continues to address the needs of industry participants. And you'll see in the bottom box here as well, we also have a ICoT technical working group, and there's significant expertise that resides within your firms around sustainability, traceability, and we already have specifications drawn up for some elements of what we're doing, and that this particular working group, this technical working group, is the group where we want to bring in expertise from your organizations to review our plans and to input into them, so that we can make sure that ICoT delivers the service that the market and the companies represented on this call need. So, in summary, the Oversight Committee framework provides real transparency in terms of the service that we're providing, and provides a really good way to engage all stakeholders, whether that be origin countries, national competent authorities, policymakers, in the delivery of the service, all building trust, allowing us to maintain the tradability of coffee. But this final slide, we just want to set out what we're really trying to achieve with ICoT, and we'll focus on the sort of benefits on the right hand side here. One of the key benefits that ICoT can provide is that we can keep the supply chain commoditized, and keep the flexibility that you have today in how you buy and how you sell your coffee. ICoT will support both the direct and the indirect supply chain. And importantly, we realize that many firms on this call have spent considerable amounts of money, time, effort over the past 15-20 years on their sustainability processes and technology and people. And we feel that ICoT leverages a huge amount of all of that work, and improves the return on investment on that work, because you're essentially able to, through using ICoT and the data that you provided and all the work that you've done before, you're able to use ICoT to maintain the existing business models that you have today, and maintain the commoditized nature of coffee. And finally, of course, and not insignificantly, is that we reduce the risk of non-compliance. If you're buying or selling a parcel on ICoT, you'll know that you've done a significant amount of validation work has gone on that data, on those parcels, and that people, that your counterparties can buy and sell with confidence, with a greatly reduced risk of non-compliance. That brings us to the end of this presentation. Thank you all very much indeed. Again, we've got our contact details here at the end of the slide. ibalondon@ice.com. We'd be delighted to meet with any of you at any time for one-on-one discussions, and we do appreciate that it's a big topic, and we've gone through a lot of information, and so I very much hope this isn't the last time that we'll engage with many of you on this call. Thank you again, and thank you very much, Paul, to you and your team for this opportunity. We really do appreciate it.
That's great. No, thank you very much, and thank you to all our presenters that have presented today. We have about 20 minutes left. We're going to try and get as many questions in as possible, so I'm going to ask all of our presenters if they can be as concise as possible with their answers. I mentioned earlier we will be making available a YouTube presentation of this in due course. Gary, can I come to you to start with? We've had one or two questions about inevitably what the cost is going to be of ICoT. Do you envisage a dry run and testing it out with one or two sort of parties before it sort of goes live? What's your sort of timetable? And also, do you have any understanding about the sort of the IT interaction between ICoT and the EU system? I appreciate that it's still in development as well. Will it be a manual sort of transfer? Will it be an automatic sort of downlink, etc.? Can you pick those up, please?
Yeah. Okay, so on that second point of the EU information system, so We have seen demo of it, and yeah, initially there is no API for the EU information system, that which would mean that ICoT will facilitate the due diligence statement by essentially providing data that you could download and then upload yourself to the EU information system. This has been raised as an issue by some of the EU countries themselves, because there have been questions over there are going to be millions of due diligence statements when you look across all products, not just coffee and cocoa, but also wood and the others. Some countries saying that they're expecting up to 10 million due diligence statements a year. And for that to be practical, they're expecting the EU to have to implement something like an API on the EU information system. And so they're pushing for that. And we would support that, because that would greatly facilitate our ability to submit a due diligence statement for an operator.
I think there was one question on the cost, wasn't there, Paul?
Okay, yeah.
Which I'll take, but we haven't finalised what those fees are. We very much expect them to be in line with other similar quality costs that exist in the market, but we haven't yet finalised that.
Okay, thanks. And Toby, one or two questions for you, if I may. There was questions about the issue of the US. So obviously the markets in the US are not going to be requiring this. What are the implications? Does that introduce essentially a two-tier market between sort of EUDR compliant and non-compliant, particularly Arabica, I guess, on the sort of the global basis? And what are the implications of that? You're on mute, Toby.
Yeah, sorry. Got a complicated question. So obviously you have to differentiate between the implications for the physical market and the implications for the futures market. For the physical market, then you'd have to talk to a physical trader. But obviously coffee coming into Europe, both Arabica and Robusta in the physical market, needs to meet the regulations, but it doesn't if it goes to the US. But it seems lots of people are talking about similar regulations coming into force in the US. So it's really a question of how long could there be a difference in regulation between Europe and US as far as physical markets are concerned. But for the futures market, as I said, we've been listening to views. We will be continuing to listen to views, and we will be discussing potential contract changes at length over the next coming weeks, and look out for notices from both exchanges from that perspective. Both the Coffee C Arabica contract and the Robusta contract that I look after, they both have delivery points within the EU and within North America. So the coffee that's delivered into the EU, if it can't meet EU regulations, it's not usable in Europe. So therefore, the suggestion has been from most participants that we align those standards. It's not yet been suggested. You know, we have to decide. We will discuss, and then it has to be decided whether we would apply that to the US, but those regulations aren't currently required to the US. So yes, there could potentially be a difference between the two, which there will be anyway in the physical market.
Okay, thanks for that. I think that is something that everybody will sort of follow with interest. As you say, the US is looking at it. I should also mention at this stage, of course, the UK is still looking at it. We have the base legislation there under the Environment Act. We're waiting to see the sort of the secondary detailed legislation, but we have been waiting quite a time. And various timescale promises have been and gone, but we just have to wait and see what's going to happen. Freddie, from your point of view, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Toby.
Well, I was going to say, Paul, as well, that as you pointed out to me before, a lot of coffee that's roasted and then ultimately manufactured into finished products in the UK actually then goes back to Europe. So you have to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, and actually on that point, we've had one or two questions about soluble coffee. The EU legislation only refers to Chapter 9, which is roast and ground, and obviously green. My reading of this is, if you're bringing any coffee under Chapter 9 in to make instant coffee, it is caught by the legislation. But if that instant coffee is coming in as a Chapter 21 product, then at this stage it isn't covered. Questions have been asked as to why, but the Commission have basically come back and said it will be looked at when we do our 2-year review. So at the moment, that's the sort of the situation as far as incidents concerned. Freddie, a couple of questions here about sort of how to what scale can you or how far can you drill down in terms of the sort of specific pieces of land, and also I guess a much wider question which will apply to lots of other sort of potential solutions to this. What are the implications as far as GDPR is concerned?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. So I'll take those one by one. The answer, and I think there's Pam Thornton, and I think a couple of others have asked that. So thank you for your questions, guys. With regards to how specific you can get, in many cases, it's meter by meter. So that includes that it helps that those, even with very small plots of land, and our R&D teams are out on the ground all the time making those samples better. In terms of GDPR, we always are GDPR compliant. And I'm happy to pick up on that specific point offline with anyone who has a particular concern. Paul, I wonder if I might also take the opportunity. There's a couple of questions that have been asked around the role of artificial intelligence to this that might be worth us just sort of closing off quickly in the spirit of brevity. So I don't know, the user was anonymous, so whoever you are, thank you for your question. At Oritain, we are already building artificial intelligence, the immense power it brings. With obviously proper safeguards into all of the technology we do, because it allows us to process quicker, cut down cost, while still maintaining rigorous data-driven insights, as well as all of our forensic science, which is ultimately the gold standards, as we've seen with the United States. So hopefully that covers off that question. And back to you, Paul.
Great, thank you very much. Toby, can I come back to you again? There was a couple of questions. One, in relation to the slides you presented, where I think you had your 3 scenarios where you were looking at sort of whether stuff was custom cleared or not. And there was a question about whether the German authorities had a different sort of view in terms of the middle of those options, where coffee had been custom cleared prior to the end of December next year. The suggestion that all parties downstream were still caught by the legislation, which I think is actually what you would probably say, isn't it? Everybody has a responsibility, but it's where that sort of first kicks in as far as the regulation's concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the authorities in Germany or for the regulators. We've asked for that question to be clarified, and I think the FAQ seems to suggest that there might still be a problem further down the supply chain, further down the chain, even if goods had cleared customs prior to the end of December 2024. So I think those questions are, I think the German Trade Association are trying to clarify that right now. So I can't really speak for them either. I certainly think you have to be wary of that. The complication, of course, is that if you bring coffee into Europe before the end of December 2024, and then you clear it through customs, importantly, before the end of December 2024, if there isn't a system in place to lodge your due diligence statement, then how would you do that in January or February 2025? So how would you prove your compliance? I think that's a further complication. So the question is, what are the authorities intending to do with coffee that cleared customs in December 2024, but actually is turned into manufactured product in 2025? What are the authorities intending to do? And secondly, well, what system could you use? Because if the system isn't there to lodge your information in November, December 24, what would they be looking at in 2025? It's a very important question. I can't answer it. We have to wait for the authorities to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's also worth saying at the moment, if you read the preamble to the regulation, the Commission do put a lot of emphasis on the policing of all of this being done at national level by member states. So we may see slightly different approaches or slightly different levels of policing across different member states, depending on sort of resource levels. Just one other quick one for you, Toby, here, and it goes back, I think, to one of your earlier slides where you talked about time of production in relation to Article 9, and somebody suggested, well, this is quite vague for coffee. What level of accuracy are they looking for? Because sometimes it's a period of time to gather sufficient cherries from trees to essentially make a container full.
Yeah, I don't know whether Gary's going to help me out here, but again, you'd have to read the regulation in full, but that point about the time of production is relevant with regard to the entry into force date. It's not relevant with regard to the entry into application date. So if you're worrying about, sort of questioning and worrying about when the coffee was produced, it's really only coffee produced around the time of 29th of June 2023, whether that's harvested or exported or whatever, around that time where it becomes important. So Gary,
yeah, so it is mentioned, it's not within the due diligence statement itself, but there is reference to having the time of, exactly, I'll have to check exactly what term it's used, but the time or period of production for when product was sourced from each plot. And you're right, it isn't clear in terms of when it was actually removed from the tree, or is it some point later. I mean, we're generally hoping, if they do want that to be checked, that it could be the date the product was moved from the farm, because that's the first date that you could possibly have any evidence for it, because it's not like a farmer is going to be logging in an official system when they actually harvest. So that's the only date we can think of that makes sense, unless they'll accept when they mention the time period. Some people have suggested maybe they would accept details of a season, but that's very vague.
Yeah,
I think the important point there is that again, going back to the burden of proof. So the company bringing the coffee into Europe and selling it in Europe, they need to be able to prove. They would need to be able to prove that, right? So obviously, it'd be very difficult to prove when someone pulled the cherry off the tree. So one would imagine they'd be looking for more. Authorities would be looking for more substantial evidence. We certainly, if that becomes important for the exchange, we'll be looking at some verifiable. Would be looking for verifiable, recognised documents that the authorities that would accept if for anything around that period.
And I think it's important. There was a question asked earlier on about, is there a standardised risk assessment? And I think it was in relation to, is that something that ICoT are going to tap into? I guess my view on that would be that there isn't going to be a standardised risk assessment, because there isn't a standard approach as such. It is, there are, and particularly if you're having to do risk mitigation, it becomes quite a sort of specific set of information that you're going to be gathering, albeit from a general sort of pool of types of information. So I think there is quite an onus on the individual sort of operators to look at the situation where they're buying from. And, this may take us back into this concern that a lot of people raise about, are we going to find that there are some origins that are just proving too difficult, certainly in the early sort of stages, to get all of this information, and what are the implications of that, and indeed how did the Commission sort of react to that? And there's a couple of, or two or three queries both today and came in earlier about certification. I thought I would just, my understanding of certification systems is they will be able to deliver part of the information that you are looking for in terms of traceability. It's questionable whether any are going to be able to deliver all, and I think they would probably say the same, but they will play a part. My understanding, however, is that the liability remains with you as the operator for the information that they are generating and providing to you. So I think that is something that has to be borne in mind. Yes, they will play a role, but ultimately you as the operator, the person bringing it into the EU, hold the full sort of liability for the information that is being provided. Just click through.
So long as that system provides identity preserved data.
Sorry, who said that? I just got onto one of the screens.
Yeah, so those systems would have to be providing data that ensure that as at least IP identity preserved for the.
There's a question that's come in. It was addressed to Toby. Maybe Freddie, you would also have a view on it as well, about where does data ownership lie when it comes to farm level geolocation data? And I think this is an issue which is is growing in other commodity sectors sort of globally as well. The ownership of data, and I guess therefore the value of data. Would anybody like to sort of comment on that question? Is it the exporter who owns the data or the producer?
Sure. I mean, from an Oritain perspective, there's two elements to that, Paul. I think the first is that all the data that we create is our own in the sense of the initial mapping stages of all the databases. But then we work very closely with our clients that then when that data is created by them, then it becomes theirs and it stays with them. That way, then you're not having secondary data, which is something that is a huge issue. And I think for me, it also speaks to the broader point around you only get in what you get out. So if you don't put quality in, you're going to get rubbish out. And it also, I think, at Oritain, what we've always tried to do is to ensure that the chain of custody for these things, right the way down to that meter by meter, ensures that it's robust and its integrity is still there. And that meets the very high criteria that we set ourselves. So that would be our inputs from an Oritain perspective. Any
other presenters have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just from our point of view, well, the data, we receive the data on ICoT from the operators. So it's certainly not data that ICE owns. Where we need licenses to use data, we will get those as required, but we certainly won't own the data ourselves. It really belongs to the operators. They're the people providing us with the data for us to validate and to use.
I think it's also worth remembering as well, Paul, that again, don't shoot the messenger, but the regulation stipulates that the farm geolocation points must be listed on the due diligence statement, and that information must be transferred from seller to buyer, and also that will be published on a public ledger. So the European Parliament, the European law has decreed that needs to take place.
Sorry, there's a reaction to, actually, I think, to Clive, to what you were saying. Are you saying that importers can't provide your producer data on their behalf? This person's thinking about co-ops with low technical penetration, so low sort of tech abilities.
To the extent that I've understood the question, any data that enters the ICoT platform will come from the operator, and the operator will have sourced that data from a number of different places. If you think back to Gary's first diagram, whether that be national traceability systems, third-party systems, in-house systems, others. So it's up to the operator to collate the information that ICoT needs to be able to validate the data, and then that data will move through the chain as the parcels are traded. But the key point here is that it's the operators who need to be able to provide the data in the first instance.
Right, I think apologies to those whose questions we haven't got to. I think we are out of time and we're going to have to wrap up. I would say if you have a question that hasn't been answered, you're still desperate to get the answer to it, can you email it to us here at BCA, and the details will be available. Well, you should have them already. If not, info@britishcoffeeassociation.org. And we'll try and get those answered, even if it means passing them out to one of the presenters to sort of answer. As I've said a couple of times, there's a YouTube sort of video of this coming shortly, so you will be able to access that to pick up other points that you may have sort of missed. And again, a reminder that we will be producing the third version of our own sort of Q&A on this that members will see in the next few weeks. I suppose my plea is, this is really about communicating with your suppliers, with your customers. I think there are still a number of parts of the chain that have a lower than needed understanding of what's going to be required of them, and it may be simply about passing information on. I think, go back through your chains and try and ensure that as many people as possible understand what's coming down the road. I said at the start, it's coming relatively quickly, certainly for some origins. and setting aside the points Toby's made about customs clearance, etc., and the additional complications that sort of come in there. And bearing in mind that, you know, although we're in the UK, a lot of you will be caught by this, whether you're sort of taking coffee from the EU in whatever form, putting it back into the EU, then the requirements sort of sit on you if you're the first person putting it into the EU. And again, as Toby's hinted at, you know, the rest of the world is looking at this, certainly in terms of the big consuming countries, including the UK, and we wouldn't expect the EU to be out there on its own for too much longer. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. It's been a great response to this. It's a topic that I know will run, and we may sort of have to run other sessions on it. I know there are one or two other sort of providers of systems that have been on the call. Drop us a line if you sort of, you know, want to sort of make your details sort of available, and you know, we might put together a group of providers of different solutions and make them available on the website, just so people have a point of access that they can then follow up with. Thanks once again to our 4 presenters. Great opportunity. Seeing 1 or 2 thanks coming up on the screen as well. Great to get through a lot of detail. I appreciate that some of it's had to be a bit rushed. There's a lot more to sort of understand, and there will be other questions that come out and other questions that don't yet have an answer, but will do relatively soon. So with that, once again, thanks to the 4 guys. Thanks also to Thomas, who's put this together, my colleague. If you have any thoughts on future webinars that you want us to run, just drop us a line and know. But with that, thanks and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.